Generation X is often described as the generation caught in the middle. They came after the huge, attention-grabbing baby boom generation, and before the much-discussed millennials. Because of that position, Gen X can sometimes feel like the overlooked chapter in modern generational history. But this cohort helped bridge two very different worlds, the analog world of landlines, paper maps, and broadcast television, and the digital world of personal computers, video games, cable TV, and eventually the internet. Most definitions place Generation X as people born from 1965 to 1980, though exact boundaries can vary slightly depending on the researcher. In the United States, this made Gen X smaller than the baby boom generation before it, but still massive in influence. They were children during social change, teenagers during the rise of MTV and video games, young adults during the end of the Cold War, and midlife adults during the transformation of work in the early 21st century. To understand Gen X, it helps to understand their family position. Many Gen Zers were the children of the silent generation and older baby boomers. Later, many became the parents of millennials and Generation Z. This means they often served as a bridge not only culturally, but inside families. They were raised by parents who had grown up with strong post-war institutions, traditional expectations, and a clear faith in work and stability. But Gen X came of age as some of those assumptions were being questioned. Divorce became more common. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers. Economic life became more uncertain for many households. Traditional authority still existed, but it felt less absolute than it had for earlier generations. So Gen X learned early that institutions could change, families could change, and the future might not look like the past. One of the most famous labels attached to Generation X is the Latchkey Generation. The phrase refers to children who came home from school to an empty house and used their own key to get inside. This was not true for every Gen Zer, of course, but it captured a real social shift. In the 1970s and 1980s, more mothers were working outside the home, divorce rates had increased, and after-school childcare was not as widely available or normalized as it later became. Many children spent afternoons unsupervised or lightly supervised, making snacks, watching television, doing homework, or roaming neighborhoods with friends. This experience helped shape the popular image of Gen X as independent, self-reliant, and skeptical of being overmanaged. Childhood for many of them involved a lot of freedom, but also a lot of responsibility at a young age. The childhood world of Gen X was also defined by what would later be called free-range parenting. Kids walked or biked to school, stayed outside until the streetlights came on, and arranged their own play without constant adult coordination. Compared with later parenting styles, this could look shockingly hands-off. But at the time, it was often seen as normal. The result was a generation that learned to solve everyday problems without always asking an adult first. They figured out bus routes, settled playground disputes, entertained themselves, and navigated boredom. This upbringing is one reason Gen X is often associated with pragmatism. They were not necessarily raised with constant praise or constant monitoring. Many learned that if something needed doing, they should probably just get on with it. By adolescence and young adulthood, Gen X acquired another label, the MTV Generation. MTV launched in the early 1980s and changed the way music, fashion, celebrity, and youth identity worked. Music was no longer only something you heard on the radio or bought on a record. It was something you watched. The music video became a cultural language, blending sound, image, attitude, and style into a package that could travel instantly through cable television. For Gen X teenagers, this helped create a shared cultural environment that was faster, flashier, and more fragmented than what many older people were used to. Pop stars, rock bands, dancers, rappers, and alternative acts all became part of the visual soundtrack of youth. MTV did not just play music, it helped teach a generation how to read irony, image, and cool. Gen X youth culture was unusually diverse in its musical identities. Dance pop, new wave, punk rock, hip-hop, heavy metal, alternative rock, rave, and grunge all shaped different corners of the generation. These were not just playlists, they were social signals. The music someone followed could shape how they dressed, who they hung out with, what values they claimed, and how they expressed alienation or belonging. Punk and grunge could express frustration with conformity. Hip-hop gave voice to urban experience, creativity, and social commentary. Rave culture created temporary communities around electronic music and nightlife. Heavy metal and alternative rock offered their own forms of intensity and rebellion. Gen X did not have one single sound. Its soundtrack was a series of scenes, each with its own language and tribe. Film also had a huge influence on Gen X. They grew up as Hollywood learned how powerful franchises and mega-sequels could be. Blockbuster storytelling became a shared cultural event, with characters, catchphrases, and worlds that extended beyond a single movie. At the same time, independent film gained influence, helped in part by video technology and new distribution possibilities. This gave Gen X both mass spectacle and low-budget experimentation. Video stores became cultural classrooms where teenagers and young adults could discover old films, cult films, horror films, comedies, and foreign cinema. Unlike earlier generations, Gen X did not have to wait for a television broadcast to revisit a film. They could rent it, rewind it, quote it, and build identity around it. Movies became portable pieces of culture. Generation X was also the first generation to experience video games as a major part of childhood entertainment. Arcades were social spaces filled with glowing screens, competition, and pocket change. Then home systems brought that experience into living rooms. This mattered because games introduced a new kind of relationship with media. Instead of only watching stories, Gen X kids could interact with them. They learned patterns, reflexes, strategy, frustration, and mastery through screens. Early video games were simple by today's standards, but culturally they were revolutionary. They helped normalize the idea that digital technology could be playful, immersive, and personal. That made Gen X an important transitional generation, not digital natives in the same way as Gen Z, but early digital adapters who watched the screen become interactive. Politically, Gen X came of age during a dramatic global transition. They were young as the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc approached their final years, and many witnessed the end of the Cold War as students or young adults. In Central and Eastern Europe, this meant the collapse of communist governments and a transition toward capitalism. In the Western world, the same period was shaped by the dominance of conservative politics and free market economics. These shifts created a powerful atmosphere. Old ideological structures seemed to be breaking apart, while markets, individualism, and globalization were gaining strength. For Gen X, adulthood began in a world that seemed both newly open and newly uncertain. Big systems could fall. Careers could change. Stability could not be taken for granted. This background helps explain why Gen X has often been stereotyped as cynical, disaffected, or slacker. In the 1990s especially, media portrayals often framed young adults as detached from ambition, suspicious of corporate culture, and allergic to idealistic slogans. But the stereotype was only partly accurate. What looked like apathy was often a form of skepticism. Gen X had grown up seeing institutions questioned, families reorganized, economies restructured, and media images become more artificial and self-aware. Their humor often leaned ironic because sincerity could feel like a sales pitch. Their distrust of authority was not always rebellion for its own sake, it was an instinct developed from watching promises fail or change. The so-called slacker image hid a generation that was observing carefully and adapting quietly. In the workplace, Generation X developed a reputation for independence and productivity. Many Gen Zers entered careers before smartphones and remote work, but after corporate loyalty had started to weaken as a guaranteed bargain. They learned to be self-directed, to build skills, and to avoid depending too heavily on one employer. Research in midlife has often described them as active, happy, and focused on achieving work-life balance. This makes sense given their history. Having grown up with shifting family structures and busy households, many understood the costs of work-consuming family life. At the same time, their latchkey independence made them comfortable handling responsibility without constant supervision. In modern workplaces, Gen X often became the practical middle layer, managing teams, translating between older and younger colleagues, and getting work done without much fanfare. Gen X is sometimes called the forgotten generation, but that may be exactly why its influence is easy to miss. They did not arrive with the enormous size of the baby boomers, and they have not received the same level of cultural analysis as millennials or Gen Z. Yet they shaped the transition into the world we live in now. They helped make alternative culture mainstream, turned video games and home video into ordinary life, adapted from analog childhood to digital adulthood, and brought a pragmatic approach to work and family. They were the kids with keys around their necks, the teenagers watching music videos, the young adults seeing old political orders collapse, and the midlife adults balancing independence with responsibility. Generation X may have been overlooked, but it was never insignificant. If you found this helpful, please like this video and subscribe for more explainers.